Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Mark Frazier, and I am in the Department of Politics here at the New School for Social Research. The other hat that I wear is as a co-academic director of the India-China Institute, which is an organization, a research center here that does programming and sponsors research on comparisons of and interactions between China and India. And we have thoughts about a future discussion on corruption, in fact, in the next year or so. And I'm very honored to be serving as the moderator for this panel. I will be introducing our speakers who need very little in the way of introduction. Many of they're all known to you, I'm sure, very well. And I will try to do justice to the many accomplishments that each of them presents. I wanted to, before doing so, thank Arian and the organizers and the designers of the conference for including a panel like this that I think will serve as an excellent point of departure for today's discussion and a transition from the wonderful keynote that we heard last night. Because I think when one talks about corruption, the conceptual and the cultural embedding of the concept becomes very, very important. And this morning's panel, as well as others today, will help us put into necessary historical context, philosophical and conceptual frameworks for getting our hands around the notion of corruption and how its meanings and how its semantic fields and so forth vary across time and across cultures, of course. Our first speaker this morning is Professor Alvin Ryan, Professor of Politics and Acting Director of the Values and Public Life Program at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He's the author of biographies known to many of you, I'm sure, on John Stuart Mill, Bertrand Russell, and John Dewey. Sometimes when I say John Dewey, I want to say our own John Dewey, but it would be perhaps a little bit of a stretch, but of course he's instrumental in the founding of the New School in 1919. Professor Ryan was previously warden of New College and a professor of politics at the University of Oxford. He is, as many of you know, a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement. Following Professor Ryan's presentation, we will hear from Bo Rothstein, who holds the August Ross Chair in Political Science at the University of Gothenburg. He became, in 1993, professor at the Swedish Institute for Working Life Research in Stockholm. His works, his books, among his main books, are Just Institutions Matter, The Moral and Political Logic of Universal Welfare, and Social Traps and Problems of Trust, both published by Cambridge University Press. And most recently, and I believe there are flyers for which you can purchase this at a discount, the book, The Quality of Government, The Political Logic of Corruption, Inequality, and Social Trust, published 2011 by the University of Chicago Press. I have a flyer here if there's not one available. I think it's also important to note that in 2002, he received the prize for the defense of academic freedom from the Swedish Association of University Teachers. Our third panelist is Deborah Satz, the Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics in Society and Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University, where she is also the Senior Associate Dean for Humanities and the Arts. Her research and today's talk focuses on the ethical limits of markets, the place of equality in political philosophy, and much else. Her publications have appeared in journals such as Philosophy and Public Affairs, Ethics, Journal of Philosophy, and the World Bank Economic Review. She is also at Stanford the director of the Stanford Center on Ethics, and for her inspiring teaching, as you will note in her biography, she has received the Walter J. Gore Award for Excellence in Teaching, which is Stanford's highest teaching award. Each of the speakers this morning has been given 20 minutes. I will just note to them when They have about 5 minutes to go. And please join me now in welcoming all of them and our first speaker, Professor Alan Ryan.
I worry slightly about doing this at a lectern because it's well known that anybody with the title of professor, if they stand at a lectern, they talk for 53 minutes, and I have 20. So what I'm going to do is not what it says on the label on the tin. I thought that there must be a colossal literature on the rise of the notion of transparency in the 18th century, and I'm afraid there isn't. There are all kinds of interesting notions about transparency, but they don't bear in the way I had hoped on our subject. So what I'm going to do is a couple of minutes of introductory remarks about the notion of corruption, and then 5 quick vignettes taken from the beginning of the 18th century, arguments in Britain which have a tremendous resonance in pre-revolutionary America. What you might think of as the argument between Rousseau and Hume on the virtues of corruption in keeping the show on the road. Little bit about Bentham, little bit about the decay of corruption, and then a few rather unhappy remarks about the inability of transparency to put a stop to various sorts of what looked to me like political corruption, and a couple of explanations of why this is so, drawn really from a long tradition that starts with Walter Lippmann casting doubt on the existence of any such thing as public opinion some 90 years ago. So here we go. What counts as corruption clearly varies dramatically from one place to another. British academic looking at the admissions practices of American private universities thinks the whole thing is corrupt because people aren't taken in as students on the grounds of their academic capacities and their ability to get a lot out of a course. They're taken in family connections, their ability to throw footballs about, and all kinds of stuff which, to a British eye, looks like ingratiating yourself with donors and all sorts of other slightly suspect things foreign to the mission of what we have been brought up to think a university is. You can play that game right across the spectrum. And I will end by saying a few things about different conceptions of democracy leading to different notions of what is acceptable behavior on the part of politicians. But there is a large literature, some of it contributed to by a friend of mine, former pupil Mark Philp, which insists, and I think quite rightly, that to talk about corruption is in effect, and I think we saw this yesterday evening, in fact, with Peter Eigen's talk, it's to talk about the negative face of some conception of good governance, and that means proper behavior of businesses, proper form of interaction between politicians and businesses, proper conduct of democratic politics. And one reason why people are so interested in corruption, it seems to me, is, of course, that if you want a theory of good governance, a good place to start is by simply putting a negation sign in front of everything that goes on in Russia. General picture of corruption, 2 faces. Politicians enrich themselves by either doing favors for businessmen or shaking them down. Businessmen enrich themselves by nobbling the political system so it gives them monopolies or quasi-monopolies. I mean, standard picture. You look at societies which are notorious for corruption, you tend to see a vast amount of that. They are, in one way or another, either resource-rich countries that become kleptocracies or societies in which systematically politicians enrich themselves by doing favors for business and businesses enrich themselves by getting the politicians to rig the rules. Standard picture. So that's just the framework. So now, my vignettes. First vignette is the early 18th century in Britain. When people talk about the Whig theory of history, they have two things in mind, one of which is people who write history as a story of simple progress, and the other is the story that says how wonderful the 18th century Whigs were. Curiously enough, when the dust had settled after 1688 and James II had gone down the Channel to take refuge in France, nobody was at all sure that the regime would survive. There was a good reason for doubt, at least one part of which was that with the arrival of William III from Holland, Britain was much more entangled than ever in warfare on the continent. What did this necessitate? It necessitated a standing army. Standard, fierce Republican view, militias assist social discipline and are the only decent mode of self-defense. Standing armies always lead in one form or another either to the destruction of the political system, and they will then tell you a long story about Sulla and Caesar, or in the alternative, they lead to people simply robbing the exchequer through the system of paying for a standing army. Besides, of course, the other argument against any such thing, standing armies wish to preserve their influence, their power, therefore wish the country to get into wars, therefore are bad for peaceful modes of making money like trade. The battle in early 18th century England is fought out between the persons known to history as the court Whigs and the country Whigs. The country Whigs, as readers of Bernard Bailyn know, are essentially the 18th century American revolutionaries. And the battle they fight is a battle which is waged on the dimension of corruption. So what is the contrast they have in mind? The contrast they have in mind is between two forms of political system, one of which the paradigm cases are Sparta and the Roman Republic at its best, in which citizen virtue was the thing to rely on. Citizens were austere, uninterested in monetary gain, would not sell office, and so on down the line. And the contrast case tends to be absolute monarchy. And so the anxiety always is that the British system is going to drift off through corruption into being something like a French absolute monarchy, whatever anybody says. So what happens? Well, what happens is some very interesting pieces of misbehavior, and I'll just offer you a couple to show the kind of thing that historians do and that I actually don't. There are two kinds of venality involved. One kind of venality is simple and illegal skimming off from what gets spent by governments. And the prize example of this is a man called James Bridges, who went on to become the Duke of Chandos, built a very beautiful house, knocked down not long after, but of course, more to the point, paid for Handel's Chandos anthems, which had rather greater staying power than the great House of Canons. Who was Bridges? Bridges was the Paymaster General of the British Army. Where was the British Army between 1708 and 1713 when he held this office? Answer, in Europe, fighting the French, financed out of the British Treasury. All the funds went through Bridges. The temptation to take your slice, the good old James Plunkett doctrine that Bruce Ackerman reminded me of yesterday evening, I saw my chances and I took them. Bridges saw his chances and he took them, and roughly speaking, fiddled the exchange rates, handed over £9 to the troops for every £10 he got for the purpose, had a large network of people with whom he had to share his gains, kept double accounts, hid what he was up to from the Exchequer commissions that were meant to keep an eye on him. So the question is, why couldn't they catch him? And the answer, of course, is when he had political cover, the Exchequer was systematically kept short of auditing officers. Friends of Elizabeth Warren will, of course, draw some obvious parallels, but I wouldn't be seen dead doing anything of the sort. If you can cripple the auditors, then, of course, it's a field day for your friends who you know to be skimming. What's the other version? The other version is what is known in general as the perquisites of office, and Walpole, Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister, even now the longest Prime Minister, 1721 to 1742, he simply spent vast amounts of money on his own business. He used the Admiralty barge to bring in wine from France without paying duty on it, and he spent what people reckon to have been £35,000 a year in 18th century pounds on the support of his mistress, whom he married after the death of his first wife, made an honest woman of her, but it can't be said the mode of support was entirely honest. Would transparency have helped? And the answer is no, because people on the whole had a pretty good idea what was going on, and of course, as First Lord of the Treasury, he wasn't going to set the auditors on himself. Did he ever get his comeuppance? Well, he did before he got really into power. He spent 6 months in the Tower in 1712 for fiddling a forage contract. It was fairly clear that he hadn't actually cheated on that occasion. But it was his Tory opponents who wanted to bring him down. He was stuck in the Tower for 6 months, treated as a political martyr, and this, of course, then became the great calling card for a long, successful career. The paintings in Holcombe Hall went off to the Hermitage later on, so all sorts of things happened, but nonetheless, two distinct versions of corruption. One, real criminal behaviour, the other, the perks of office. And it's worth drawing a distinction here because, of course, a lot of people tend to think, well, of course, if that's what you're doing, this is what you're entitled to. Peter Eigen's remark yesterday evening about people saying, it's now our turn to eat. Very much the story. Now, that's one proposition. Where does Mandeville fit into this? Mandeville is the first great wicked defender of the proposition that a corrupt political system and a corrupt economic system, watering stock, stock jobbing, running up South Sea bubbles, all kinds of things like that, they make for economic growth, and then you have an assumption of trickle down that under those conditions, eventually the benefits trickle down to the poor. It's a prosperous society. Try to reintroduce Rome or Sparta in 18th century Britain, and immediate economic collapse would follow. And that's the poison that Mandeville puts into the 18th century mind. It's why all Keynesians like Mandeville, and it's why most of the opponents of Keynes think he's rather wicked, as indeed he was. He was Dutch. So, where does the argument go? My two exemplary figures would be Rousseau on the one hand and Hume on the other, and I want just to say one thing about how the corruption story can get out of hand, as I think it does in Rousseau, and how it bolts onto a transparency story getting out of hand as well. Rousseau has two notions of corruption, at least. The first is what you might call metaphysical, transformational, and absolutely irreparable. And this is the point at which a simple animal, man as he comes from the hands of God, as Rousseau says, is turned into a thinking, self-conscious creature. What happens with the arrival of speech, reason, self-consciousness, is we understand ourselves as one person among other persons. We start making comparisons, and with comparisons, what comes into the world is envy. Each wishes to be thought a better dancer and more distinguished than the others, and so on and so forth. Envy, particularly for Rousseau, of course, sexual envy. Desire for esteem. And so we present appearances to other. Rousseau's wonderful phrase, l'homme est devenu hors de lui-même. Man becomes outside himself, and we become non-transparent to ourselves. That, I reckon, is a notion of corruption which is, so to speak, irreparable, incurable. Rousseau sometimes thinks that if we get back to Sparta, we can somehow stop it. The other notion of corruption is just the standard story, which is Sparta and Rome, virtuous, modern commercial society, corrupt. Sparta and Rome, the early Roman Republic this is, Sparta and Rome at its Republican best, and of course this is Cato preaching the old story. People are as they seem. Crucially, the people are uncorrupted and their rulers are uncorrupted too. Cincinnatus returns to his plough after leading armies to victory, doesn't stay and enrich himself. So the hero of this is the politics of a Roman republic at its most austere. The virtuous kind of property is small landholdings. This is where it begins to latch into the Jeffersonian story about the virtues of yeoman farmers and so on. The vicious politics are, of course, the politics of a court, the politics of a prosperous commercial society. What does Hume do to this? Hume simply points out, if you want to run British politics in the 18th century, corruption is essential. If you don't have corruption, then the king's ministers cannot sustain the government's business, they cannot get enough support in Parliament, and therefore there has to be a device whereby the Crown can use the government's capacity to hand out sinecures, hand out offices, hand out jobs, in order to balance what would otherwise, on Hume's view, be the tendency of parliamentary representation to run off in a Cromwellian direction. And for Hume, this is always going to be how you have to keep a delicate balance. Does transparency get a look in? Of course not. What Hume wants is to protect a polite society, and a polite society is a thoroughly unnatural society, and Hume, like Dr. Johnston, was prone to think that what Rousseau was doing was prating in favour of savages. And Hume thought that there were quite enough savages among the Presbyterians on the Edinburgh Town Council who denied him a professorship. So Rousseauian hankering after austere antique virtue was just nonsense. And that becomes the argument for the defence. And it's a highly sophisticated argument, but of course when people get angry, it doesn't work. So, fourth vignette, old corruption and how it vanishes. And then my final gloomy reflections. Old corruption was the label attached to the entire edifice of late 18th century government by radicals like William Cobbett in the early 19th century. There's an enormous historiography on this stuff, and nobody quite knows how it was that the old regime survived so long and how it is that it really came to an end. People talk about moral climates, they talk about the rise of Methodism. If you're a Marxist, you talk about the industrial working class finally frightening the upper classes, except the industrial working class turns up 60 years after old corruption gets stamped on. So the industrial working class has to do some retrospective historical acting if this is to be the story. There's all kinds of stories lurking about, but it is actually interesting and peculiar as a piece of intellectual history. So what is old corruption? Old corruption is the entire fabric of manufactured positions, absurd salaries paid to people for doing nothing much. Judges were paid £10,000 a year, and sometimes were paid £10,000 a year for sitting in a court which never sat, i.e. these were sinecure positions. Some people had titles like, I forget, Receiver of the Benefices of the County of Londonderry, where there hadn't been any benefices of that kind for a very long time. But it came with £2,325 a year. The children of speakers of the House of Commons received government pensions of anything up to £2,000 or £3,000 a year. I will tell you in a moment about Oxford colleges. Some of these incomes were really colossal, and if you held enough of these sinecure posts, you could actually build up a very considerable fortune, even if you started from virtually nothing. Lord Eldon, who was the Lord Chancellor in the late 19th century, he built up colossal fortune. Time of the Great Reform Bill, Lord Brougham, reformer in his own right, very good barrister, desperately wanted to hang on to the position of Lord Chancellor because he hadn't got much money and it paid £10,000 a year. And £10,000 a year was a very great deal of money. Average farm labourer probably paid 30 shillings a week, £75 a year. So it gives you a picture of exactly why these jobs were really worth having. So why does it end when it ends? People tend to think it must have ended more or less at the end of the 18th century and such positions must have been abolished. The answer is they weren't. Lord Grey of the Reform Bill and the tea. Earl Grey and 19 relatives received something like £126,000 a year between them at the time of the passage of the Great Reform Bill in 1832. The dying out of sinecures is something that happens with what you might call the Great Victorian Clean-up. Why do I think this is interesting? Because I think this is a society acquiring a conception of what good governance, good behaviour, proper conduct in public life has to look like, and of course it makes sinecures deeply offensive to politically effective opinion. So roughly speaking, the children of the holders of sinecures don't get what they would otherwise have got. And one of the last pieces of cleaning up was the commission into the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in the mid-1850s, in which university positions finally became attached to actually doing some teaching, doing some research, and not being embarrassed when your German colleagues came and told you what they were doing. They really were doing research. We really weren't. Why did they hang on? Why were people reluctant to say goodbye to them? And the answer is for the minor gentry. For the minor gentry and upper middle class, and this is Jane Austen. You can read it in Jane Austen. The moment you see what you're looking at, you can see it everywhere. Minor gentry getting admission to an Oxford college, getting Cambridge colleges too, getting a fellowship meant that if you didn't marry, took holy orders, you had board and lodging and something like a gentleman's income, £400 a year, for the rest of your life. If, on the other hand, you'd met Mary Jane in the countryside when acting as a curate, and you terribly wanted to marry, you waited to one of the livings, parishes, that the college had the presentation of. We were Catherine de Bourgh times 49. Let's say we had 49 parishes we could put people into, and did. So you waited till one of those came vacant, got married, and you had the life of a country parson. And the better livings paid anything up to £1,000, £1,200 a year, plus a free house, plus the vicar's little farm, and so on down the line. So well worth having. So what you had in effect was real high-paid sinecures at the top, but a chain of dependency down to minor gentry. Finally, since I think I've just about exhausted everybody's patience and 20 minutes, what will transparency do and not do? Real transparency will pick up the crooks. Let's say if the auditors had ever got after Bridges properly, then this notoriously corrupt man, as they kept on calling him, would of course have been exposed. So real transparency plus determined course. Why do people like Bentham not think this is going to work? Bentham thinks that so long as you have a system of ins and outs between an essentially uniform ruling class, all of whom have an interest in the maintenance of the system, transparency in the accepted sense won't work, because the outs won't push the ins too hard because they're waiting for their turn to eat, and the outs and the ins ex hypothesi are not going to have themselves sent to jail. What's needed is democracy. Democracy is the alignment of the public interest and the particular interests of politicians and administrators, reinforced by a system of inquisitorial committees. Straightforward story. Why, for my fifth and last vignette, do I despair of this story? And the answer is that on my reading of the situation, which you got 30 seconds of last night, but I would put my name to the bottom of it, the great oddity of the American system, as things stand, is corruption occurs in broad daylight. Politicians are bought openly. I mean, there's a certain amount of hiding who exactly has contributed to what, but basically, if you have any interest in chasing where the money has come from, you can find it. Why doesn't transparency do the trick? And the answer, I think, goes back to Lippmann. We talk about civil society, we talk about the public, there is no public there. There are a lot of hard-pressed people getting on with their lives, short attention spans, hideously high information costs, no real disposition to put the fear of God into politicians. That's proposition one. Proposition two is a decentralized federal system of the American kind is just much more vulnerable to corruption than a more centralized, more populist, more parliamentarian kind of system. In England, there's plenty of corruption to go round, but it tends to take the form of MPs buying duck houses for their moats at a cost of £2,000, or employing their incompetent wives as secretaries on their parliamentary secretarial allowances, taking $500,000 from the makers of medical devices and then the next week voting against the medical devices tax, you don't get as much of in a more centralized system. And that, I think, is all I have to say.
Many thanks for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here. And many thanks to Arian for organizing everything here. Yes, I'm Bo Rothstein from the Quality of Government Institute, and the title of my talk, and I was assigned to talk about corruption and social trust. I could speak endlessly about also the conceptual things, but this is trying to figure out why is corruption so bad? Because this was not always the case. When I was a PhD student, corruption was never ever talked about. Not when I was an undergraduate or graduate, student. I've talked with, I think now, hundreds of colleagues, and it's the same. This was a non-issue. And this was, I think, for two reasons. One is we didn't have any data until Transparency International came with the first comparative data in the mid-1990s. Nobody actually knew anything about this. We could just tell stories. Secondly, there was a dominant theory saying that, yes, some corruption is probably bad, but some is probably good because it's greasing the wheels. Bypassing cumbersome and dysfunctional regulations, making officials speed up the decision-making process to help business, and so forth. And yeah, Peter Eigen talked about this yesterday. This is well known. Just an extra tax increasing the income of low pay to public officials. The question is this true? Well, if you're going to say something about how good or bad corruption is, you need two things. First, you have to compare it with something. And I would here today like to compare it with democracy. And then you must have some kind of external validation. And my external validation is human well-being. Most political scientists are interested in politics, who wins elections, why people vote, and so. I and the Quality of Government Institute team is not. We are not interested in politics, but what politics can accomplish for human well-being. So our dependent variable is not politics, but human well-being. Here we differ from most colleagues in political science, I would say. And as you know, I do not need to tell you, we are in a situation where more countries than ever are now considered to be democracies. It's difficult to think about it now, but when I was PhD student, no, earlier, a student. Countries like Spain, Greece, and Portugal were bloody dictatorships. Then they fell, then Latin America, then Eastern Europe, now many countries in Africa. Now we have democracy in countries where it was inconceivable almost 10, 15 years ago. Indonesia, Taiwan, it's fantastic, it's wonderful. And more people than ever now live in democracies, and we should all, this is a fantastic time we live under. But now comes the really bad news. We have at the Quality of Government Institute assembled what we now think are the two largest databases on anything that smells quality of government, corruption, and anything that is related to this. And I should also tell, these databases are in the public domain. They can be used directly. Oh, no? Oh, nice, thank you. So, this is what you get. The effect of democracy, as it can be measured on human well-being, is so far not impressive. This was actually alluded to, I think, 2.5 years ago in an article by Amartya Sen in the New York Review of Books, titled Quality of Life, China versus India. And as many of you know, Sen has always sort of put forward the Indian democracy. But he now has to realize that autocratic communist China outperforms democratic India on every conceivable measure of human well-being. You can take the same situation with South Africa that became a democracy in 1994, a fantastic achievement, of course. But many central measures of human well-being are today, 20 years later, actually worse than 1994. Expected living is down with 6 years. The number of women who die when they give birth has tripled. They haven't been able to increase the average month kids go to school with 1 single month. The level of inequality is as dramatically high as it was in 1994. Now, from our database, I could show endless, very sophisticated regressions, but I will just show you some very simple bivariate plots here, scatter plots. Here I have what I think is the best measure of the level of democracy on the X scale. It's a combination of polity force, how well the elections are carried out, and from Freedom House we take how well democratic rights are respected. And on the other dimension we have one of my favorite measures of human well-being, how many years you can expect to live under reasonable health. And as you can see, democracy doesn't give you anything. However, change to one of the standard measures of what we call quality of government, control of corruption, and bang, here you get something. You get a quite substantial correlation. Or take the very well-known Human Development Index and the level of democracy. Again, the correlation is basically not there. But change to control of corruption. I could show you 40 more of these. And I could take in also subjective measures like social trust or the measure of happiness. It wouldn't change. On every conceivable measure we have of human well-being, measures of the quality of government outperforms measures of democracy through and through. Now let me say, for the sake of the record, I will be the last person here and on this globe who will argue against representative democracy. This is not an argument for authoritarian rule. This is an argument saying that democracy is simply not enough. If you want to have a system, a political system that generates human well-being, democracy without quality of government will not deliver human well-being. There is even one more surprise here. Many people would here say that, okay, we don't have democracy for delivering human well-being. We have democracy for delivering political legitimacy, that we accept those rules. Here comes an even bigger surprise. We now have 3 studies based on comparative survey data showing that when people all over the globe take a stand on if they believe that their government is legitimate, democratic rights are important. But they are far less important than things like control of corruption, rule of law, and government effectiveness. The output side is much more important than the input side when people take a stand, if they perceive that their government is legitimate. Now, social trust. This came in the mid-1990s, had a very strong impact. I was recruited by an American colleague, Robert Putnam, to work with this in a comparative project. And it turns out social trust, as also a central part of social capital, to have a very important effect on social and economic development, as well as human well-being. Hundreds of studies are showing this. So I came to agree with this, but I came to disagree very much with most of my colleagues in this research area, how it is generated. The standard explanation has been that social trust and social capital is generated by people being active in voluntary association. I can assure you that there is not one single level micro evidence for this. There is nothing. And this, of course, put social science in a really bad situation. We had identified a very new important concept. We could reasonably well measure it. We could show that it had enormously important effects on human well-being, but the major theory of how it was generated did not work. So together with a number of colleagues, we turned it upside down. What we have found is that social trust is generated by perceptions of the fairness and legitimacy of the public authorities. We have experimental evidence, lots of survey evidence showing that this is the case. Quality of government, as we defined it, is the main causal factor behind levels of social trust and thus social well-being. How does it work? How strong is the impact of corruption on social trust? Well, first, we can say that the correlation between a country's level of democracy and social trust is close to 0. Again, I'm sorry to say, and I do not say this with any joy, democracy doesn't deliver social trust. However, the correlation between quality of government and social trust is substantial if you compare countries. The impact of economic and gender equality on social trust becomes negligible when you bring in quality of government variables. More surprising, and this comes from a huge project survey that I started with my colleague Alina Mungiu-Pippidi here, Anticorp. We have interviewed first 34,000 people in 2010, and then now in 2012-13, another 84,000 people in Europe. These are the largest surveys, and these are surveys that have very detailed questions both about perceptions and experience of corruption in three sectors: the police, the healthcare, and education. And we are just now working with this data. It's tremendously interesting and fun. But this is what we find. The impact of ethnic diversity on social trust becomes negligible when we bring in quality of government factors. To give you a sense of what this means, the surveys are carried out by region. And so we have 184 regions in Europe. Some countries, Romania, France, Portugal, and Belgium, and especially Italy, have huge regional variations. Southern and mid-level Italy is corrupt, I would say, not on a Nigerian, but well on a Moroccan level. But the regions in northern Italy are clean as Denmark. Now think about this. This is a society that have had the same formal institutions for 150 years. Doesn't give you anything. The cleanest region in Italy is the most ethnically, linguistically divided one, Südtirol. The worst region in Italy is Calabria, which is totally ethnically homogeneous. So this idea that have been sold very hard by some colleague that ethnic diversity brings trouble both to social trust and quality of government, well, really not. I would also like to add that the impact of participation in voluntary association on social trust, it just fades away when we bring in quality of government in these surveys. Now, people will say this is just correlation. You have to come up with a theory. How does it work? What are the causal mechanisms? People like we don't believe in anything if we cannot find micro-level evidence and a theory that explains it. And I think that we call this the corruption trust theory. People cannot know if other people in their society can be trusted. They have to use some heuristics, guesswork. They have to take information from somewhere. And we think that it works like this. If public officials in a society are known for being corrupt, partial, untrustworthy, dishonest, discriminatory, citizens will believe that even people who are required to act in the service of the public cannot be trusted. From this, they will make an inference that most other people cannot be trusted either. So if your local policeman, teacher, public health worker is dishonest, why should you think that people in general in your society can be trusted? However, we think that there are two more. People will make another inference saying that citizens will be able to see that most people in a society with corrupt, dishonest, discriminatory, clientelistic officials must take part in corruption and similar practices in order to obtain what they feel their rightful due. They will therefore make an inference that most other people cannot be trusted. And the third is, of course, that you will make an inference from yourself. The individual will realize that to get by in a society, in such a society, he will himself have to take part in those bad practices. And if you cannot trust yourself, why should you trust other people? So, some take-home lessons. Low quality of government, high corruption, has a strong negative impact on all standard measures of human well-being. That is our finding. Much stronger than democracy. It's also the case, and we just heard this, that democracy really doesn't always help against corruption. In too many, not everywhere, but in too many countries, voters do not punish corrupt politicians. They re-elect them, unfortunately. There are, of course, direct effects from corruption. You get lower effectiveness, lower competence in the civil service, insecurity. I think personally that the competence thing is also very important here. We find quite strong correlations between merit recruitment to the civil service and low and high quality government. Pay doesn't work, relative pay becomes insignificant. It's meritocratic recruitment. Now think, if President Mbeki of South Africa would have been surrounded not by political cronies, but by expert or recruited, meritocratically recruited civil servants, he probably wouldn't have said the idiotic things he said about HIV/AIDS, which, according to a conservative estimation, has costed 340,000 South Africans their life. So this is not an insignificant. But my major point here is that the indirect effects, which I think are the most important one, comes from the negative impact of social trust. Corruption destroys social trust in society. And I think when people get the question if they think most other people can be trusted in their society, as my colleague Rick Juslainer have argued, they're actually answering another question. They are making an evaluation of the moral standard of the society in which they live. And of course, if you think that the moral standard is low, that has a very strong negative impact. Economists use theories about transaction cost, and so I won't go into that. But yes, the German proverb is correct. Der Fisch stinkt vom Kopf her. That's my message. Thank you.
So I'm a philosopher. I have no data. I need to, and you might think that's corrupt, but I'm not putting myself forward as a data expert. What I want to do is just try to draw a distinction between three kinds of corruption and bring that distinction to bear on one particular social issue. So the social issue I'm interested in is thinking about privatization of government services. And I'm going to, in particular, have two striking cases. I want us to think about using the three different concepts of corruption. So as you know, many many forms of government provision have been privatized, particularly during the 1970s and 1980s. There have been many arguments both in favor and against privatization. But as I say, I want to put on the corruption hat and think about these forms of privatization through the lens of corruption. And the examples I want to give, that I want to focus on, are two. The first is military security. So a large percentage of the United States military commitment in Iraq and Afghanistan, as you know, has been comprised of private contractors. A 2007 estimate had 180,000 private contractors supplying roughly 160,000 troops in Iraq, so that the number of private contractors actually outnumbered US military personnel. And my second example is prisons. Nearly half of all immigrant detainees in America are now held in privately run prisons. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 6% of all prisoners in the United States are held in private facilities, and that number is going up. So one question is, what should we think about the privatization of various kinds of public goods provision? As I said, there are lots of debates. There's very large empirical literature debating this, thinking about benefits and costs in terms of efficiency, accountability. Some people worry that this is a diminution of government powers, while other people point that some privatization actually augments government powers because it allows the government to do things that otherwise might meet with public resistance, such as the case of costly interventions in other countries. So I want to instead put on, show that There are different kinds of corruption that could be at stake in these examples. As I say, I'm not going to give any data. I just want to think about how we can make some conceptual distinctions, and then use these to think about an example like this and other examples. So my first kind of corruption I'm going to call individual corruption. We've talked somewhat about that. It's the most common idea of corruption, the pursuit of private gain or private benefit by a public official or by somebody in an important role in exchange for promoting private interests. Individual corruption encompasses bribes, gifts, sexual favors, and nepotism. And these are cases where the individual or his designee benefits, but they're not justified by the public role or the role the person is occupying. Of course, not all the private interests in corruption are economic. A police officer who enlists others to fabricate evidence may be motivated by a misplaced sense of justice rather than by individual gain. Nonetheless, the core idea of individual corruption involves the idea of private interests invading the public domain or a trusted role under conditions that usually reveal some kind of quid pro quo benefits to the person. It might not be illegal. We heard an interesting example by Peter Eigen yesterday that bribes to parliamentarians are not illegal, but that doesn't mean it's not could not be considered a form of individual corruption. It can be very petty or localized, but it can also have very significant effects on human well-being, both in the individual case and sometimes more widespread cases. So that's my first distinction, is individual corruption, and I want to contrast it to a second kind of corruption that I'm going to call intrinsic corruption. And that's the idea that sometimes a good is inappropriately valued. So a lot of people who write about markets worry, this is a worry that has been associated with Michael Walzer and Michael Sandel and Elizabeth Anderson, worry that putting a certain kind of good on the market corrupts the intrinsic nature of that good. It's not neutral. It actually extinguishes the good in question. The classic case that's given is friendship. Supposing you want more friends than you have. You try to buy one. The offer immediately extinguishes the good that you're seeking, which is a true friend. And you can take that idea of intrinsic corruption and apply it to some important government functions. For example, it's essential to the proper workings of a criminal justice system that officers of the court not be motivated by financial considerations when they consider punishment. Privatization of the system won't work, not because competitive markets couldn't be developed, but because the buying and selling of judicial services is automatically, as it were, a corruption of the process of dispensing justice. In a similar vein, people have thought about legislation, which is the prerogative of Congress. An attempt to delegate Congress's legislative powers to private parties would be considered by many to involve intrinsic corruption. And that idea can be traced back at least to 1690, when John Locke wrote, "The legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands, for it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others." Now, in fact, in the US, sometimes legislative power is delegated to others, but nonetheless, the idea, I think, that this is could constitute a kind of intrinsic corruption is pretty clear. So now I'll turn to a third kind of corruption, which I'm going to call institutional corruption. Not my own designation, but I want to flag this as a kind of corruption distinguished from both individual corruption and from intrinsic corruption. So institutional corruption doesn't have to involve quid pro quo exchanges, nor does it automatically lead to the extinguishing of a valued good. So, for example, campaign contributions, assuming they're not quid pro quo, are not necessarily a case of institutional corruption. In some cases, campaign contributions enhance or at least don't damage political competition and citizen representation. But contributions are corrupt when they're of a type and scale as to undermine the processes and damage the core purposes of the institution of representative democracy. So we have three kinds of corruption: individual corruption, intrinsic corruption, and institutional corruption. And although these are sometimes hard to distinguish in practice and are often found together, they're importantly different, and it's important to keep them different because the measures that might be helpful in addressing one might not work for the other. And I think Alan brought that out when he was saying transparency might work for some forms of corruption but might not work as well for others, and I'll come back to that example. So let me apply these three kinds of corruption to the case of reliance on markets, in the case to privatization of government services, in the case of military service and prisons. So let's start with individual corruption. Often lying behind the discomfort with private prisons and private military contractors is a concern that market incentives corrupt individual character. So while Manville praised private vice as the source of public virtue, we know that private vice often leads simply to public vice. So from the perspective of individual corruption, mercenaries are those who accept a bribe to fight. This can be seen as a case of intrinsic corruption of motivation. You're doing it for the wrong reason, but it can easily turn into individual corruption. Having accepted one such bribe, it may seem reasonable to worry that the individual's private interest will now invade public interests. So along these lines, Machiavelli worried that mercenaries were unlikely to fight hard because they weren't closely identified with the causes of the wars they participated in. He actually thought they would slack off, which is very interesting, very different than the way we can think about mercenaries in the modern world. But Machiavelli worried they just wouldn't do the job. And so that he preferred, in that sense, a non-mercenary army. And a side note, there's some evidence that there are less human rights abuses conducted by mercenaries than by ordinary soldiers, at least in the modern world. So just flag that as a... But notice, if you're objecting to privatization of military services for this reason, you'll have trouble distinguishing mercenaries from regular soldiers. After all, regular soldiers are paid for their services, and today's Army markets itself as a career option. And while many soldiers identify with the cause of their country, they're more likely to be identified with the men with whom they fight. So at least if you're objecting to privatization because of individual corruption, you should extend your arguments against Blackwater, what the organization formerly known as Blackwater, now known, I think, as Academy, to the case of volunteer soldiers. And there is an argument about a volunteer army being a form, likely form of both intrinsic and individual corruption. Okay. What about the intrinsic corruption objection in the case of privatization of the military and privatization of prisons? Well, if we define a mercenary as someone who hires himself to the highest bidder, it's clear that such a person is not likely to be pursuing war for the right reasons. So that's a case of intrinsic corruption of motivation, although, as I mentioned, it's an interesting question to ask as to how many soldiers, ordinary soldiers, are fighting wars for the right reasons. But if it's true that a mercenary is somebody who hires himself to the highest bidder, there's intrinsic corruption of motivation. But there's another important argument against market privatization of some government services from the perspective of intrinsic corruption. According to this argument, the privatization of some goods has to fail to deliver those goods because privatization necessarily turns certain public goods into private goods. So I already gave the example about the privatization of judicial services and legislative decisions, right? That privatization would destroy the kind of good in question. So the question is whether or not this could be extended, not just to the execution, not just to the fundamental decisions to go to war or about the appropriate punishment for a criminal defense, but about the execution of such decisions. So some people might believe that executing a war could be better performed by private bodies, and if it could be done better by private bodies, it should be done by them. Similarly, although judicial decisions to imprison a person for a certain period of time is public, somebody might think that establishing a private prison is permissible because it might bring cost savings and some other goods. So how might you take the argument from intrinsic corruption and try to extend it to the execution of the decisions? Why should it matter who's executing the decision? Well, I'll give you an analogy, and then I'll turn back to this case. So think about blood feuds, like the kind in Romeo and Juliet between the Capulets and the Montagues. So in a blood feud, actually, the identity of the person executing the decision matters, right? Even if, my best friend could be a more efficient revenge seeker and maybe even minimize deaths, there's a difference between the killing by a family member for honor and the delegating to somebody else, which turns an honor killing into murder. So you might try to make a similar kind of argument with the privatization of military and punishment decisions. And the idea would be something like, you have to stand in the right relation to the state in order for the action to count as the state's doings. And so the idea would be that state employees and bureaucrats and members of state organizations stand in a different kind of relation to the state than private contractors. Now, and so outside the appropriate relational context, the actions of private parties can't be the doings of the state. In the case of private prisons, we get private disciplining by wardens and not justice. And in the case of private security forces, we get homicide and not acts of national defense. Now, I've, in other writings, been very skeptical of the corruption argument, and I think there are reasons to be somewhat skeptical of it. But I want to at least point to the fact that it poses a powerful regulatory challenge if you think that the relation of private parties is looser and weaker to the state, and especially as private parties often involve many subcontracting relations, and lead people that they're tied less, that a member of a private organization is tied less closely to the state's aims than state employees who defer to the state out of a sense of loyalty, whereas private employees may have their own interests to attend to, especially when profit-making is at stake. Now, as I say, I've expressed a skepticism about this kind of argument, but one way to think about it is that it's actually posing a powerful regulatory challenge. The link between, the link is more attenuated in the case of privatization. It's harder to specify the contracts. There's much more need for careful design. And so there's a question about what the ideal regulatory regime would be here. Finally, I want to turn to the idea that the public purpose of an institution can be undermined by certain practices, what I called institutional corruption. So unlike the cases of individual and intrinsic corruption that can obtain in a single case, institutional corruption involves an ongoing series of relationships or practices that undermine the purpose and functioning of an institution. How would this concern show up in the privatization of the military and prisons? While society has a strong interest in reducing the amount of crime and consequently the number of people in prison, the interests of the private prison industry can press in a different direction. To give two telling examples, recently the private prison industry was secretly involved in drafting Arizona's harsh anti-immigration law, a law that, incidentally, would boost demand for its immigrant detention centers. And the Corrections Corporation of America has offered to relieve the fiscal crises of 48 states by buying their prisons, but only provided that the states agree to keep the prisons 90% full for the next 20 years. Similarly, we might worry about this widespread regime of relying on private security. Security companies only survive if there's a demand for their services. One way to ensure demand is to try and change consumers' perceptions and about threats by engaging in deliberate efforts to increase feelings of anxiety, fear, and insecurity. But this preference manipulation interferes with society's interests, which is in the attainment of an optimal level of security. In each of these cases, private actors oriented to their own market goals and not doing anything illegal can threaten to subvert public purposes. Of course, in assessing the best policy with respect to privatization, we need to be careful not to idealize the government's roles in prisons or security. By contrast, politicians sometimes seek to manipulate fear for their own purposes. States rush to build new prisons to secure jobs for their citizens, and the state-provided prison system is rife with practices that don't support social goals. Okay, in conclusion, each of these three kinds of corruption is important in considering government and evaluating government privatization. Individual corruption is probably best addressed through accountability and transparency mechanisms and a watchdog press. While individual corruption is an important factor to consider in cases of privatization, in the US, it's more likely to be a limited problem composed of isolated acts of malfeasance whose effects could be constrained. The challenges to privatization posed in terms of intrinsic corruption and institutional corruption are far greater. The perspective of intrinsic corruption points to the way that private actors can fail to make their actions count as the state's actions, even when they're under contract by the state, and prompts us to ask whether any regulatory schemes could help address that gap. In the case of institutional corruption, we need to deliberate about what the core purposes of an institution are, and then consider the diverse mechanisms that we have to prevent its corruption, including transparency and accountability, but also contract specification, and in some cases ensuring that the institution is cordoned off from inappropriate market pressures. In some cases, preserving an institution can require putting limits on aspects of market privatization. While I focused in this talk on privatization of military and prisons, the institutional corruption argument actually has a much wider range of application than the intrinsic corruption argument. It can be applied to campaign financing, the privatization of education, the pharmaceutical industry's role in healthcare, and the financial sector. The three different kinds of corruption are all important to consider in the context of markets and other institutions. Thanks.
I want to be the first to congratulate our panel for just a really compelling set of remarks, and also for their organization of time, which gives us about 40 minutes, maybe a few minutes less than that, to pose questions. Now, I think because of the wonderful quality of these presentations and the ideas they've raised, we're going to get a lot of questions. And what I'd like to, without objection from the panelists, to have us gather, say, in groups of 3 questions. And I'm going to ask you, when you get the microphone, I believe there are 2 mics roaming around now, to not make a statement in search of a question, but just to simply pose the question as directly as possible. If you make a statement in search of a question, I'll start waving the please wrap up sign to you. So the floor is now open, and I'll try to keep turning my head to the 2 sides as well. Okay.
Sure. This is a question for Debra. My question is, I think when you talk about individual corruption, you focus on material bribes. And my question would be, have you considered non-material bribes like flattery? So I may have misunderstood, but I want to see what you think about flattery as a potential form of bribery.
Oh, do you want to gather one or two, or do you have
Oh,
a
yeah,
clarification? Okay, yes.
I have a question about the other two parts of Professor Satz's three-part typology of corruption. So intrinsic corruption you talked about as a good being inappropriately valued, but later on you talked several times about inappropriate motivations. I'm not quite sure of the link between those two ideas. Could you clarify that? And then institutional corruption you defined in terms of public purposes of an institution being undermined by certain practices. But that sounded quite a bit like the intrinsic corruption whereby some congressional powers are delegated. So could you just clarify those two important ideas?
And sorry, could you identify yourself?
My name is Adrian Bloor from King's College London.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, we've got two right away for Deborah. Would you like to get at those? Because I didn't want too much time to pass.
So I think the question about non-material incentives is a good one. I gave the example of the police officer who was motivated by a sense of justice, and that's a non-material kind of motivation that could still represent a form of corruption. I haven't thought about flattery in the context of corruption, but I certainly think non-material incentives can count as corruption, and whether they do partly depends on whether people are then taking advantage of a public, gaining benefits that they're not entitled to insofar as they're acting in the public role. Maybe some forms of flattery are deserved. Anyway, I don't mean to just limit myself to material incentives. I think a lot of corruption involves non-material incentives. On the motive and intrinsic corruption and the nature of the good, I actually mean to apply it to both. So you could imagine the intrinsic corruption of motivation. If you think some motivation is inappropriate in a certain sphere, so that's the example of the person who's motivated by gain in a just war and not motivated properly by the aims of the war. So you could imagine it applying on the level of motivation, but it can also apply to the nature of a good, independent of what the motivation is. So the friendship example, it doesn't really matter what the motivation is. The arguments that people give it's simply incompatible with market provision. That good is destroyed by placing it on a market. And then the question is, are there other goods besides the usual? Nobel Prizes is another one. If you want to get a Nobel Prize and you don't win one in the usual way and you try to buy one, whatever you buy doesn't have the same meaning as the thing that you would be rewarded for.
Hi, my name is Priscilla. I'm from Sarah Lawrence College. I have a question for Bo. You've established this connection between the quality of government and the attainments of human well-being. But can a corrupt government still also have? Can a corrupt government have high quality of services? Also, can the presumed impact of the negative impacts of corruption be offset when there is low perception of corruption in that society?
Thank you. Alina? I believe Alina has, and then, yeah, behind.
Alina Mungiu-Pippidi from Hertie School of Governance. My question is to all the speakers and relates to the definition of corruption. We have been using it in very different senses this morning, and including in the 18th century, corruption can be used as old corruption and has a story in itself, or it can be used in a very similar meaning to the corruption that we see today. For instance, the corruption of British members of parliament who bailed out the public company, India Trading Company, when it went bankrupt out of public money because they were shareholders. And my question really is, Do we stand to gain or do we stand to lose by not bounding the term corruption? And you know very well that it's also an important legal debate these days, because some countries move on to include as corruption private relationships. Where should we go from here?
Thank you. And I believe behind you there's a question.
Hi, I'm Brigitte Zimmerman from UCSD. And my question is for Bo. You talked today about the relationship between corruption and social trust, trust in the population, but I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between corruption and trust among political officials, their relationships with each other, their trust and reciprocity, and how that's cultivated in office and then translates into corrupt behaviors.
Thank you. That's three for between Bo and Alan. Do you want to address those?
One more question.
I'm just not really certain about where to draw what sorts of line, looking for definitions of corruption, partly because I think that we work backwards from what it is we think is producing a particular sort of distortion. And that's what we count as corruption. I mean, that you're allowed to make money, but not by blackmailing people. You're allowed to do this, but not by selling your vote. And it seems to me that the obsession with corruption has got much greater over the last 25, 30 years for two really very obvious reasons. One of which is the kleptocratic politics of resource-rich countries, and the other of which is the collapse of communist regimes, which, as they were collapsing, people became more and more aware that a system which one might have thought was brutal and had all kinds of obvious human rights abuse defects in it, was nonetheless an attempt to pursue some vision of the future by heavy-handed means. And of course it then emerges, as one gets towards the final decay of the Eastern European communist countries, that they were absolutely riddled top to bottom with bribery. I remember a friend of mine who worked on Romania in particular, who said there was this concept of mutual respect. Mutual respect meant you couldn't get to see the doctor without paying a bribe. You couldn't get the pharmacy to give you your prescription without paying a bribe. You couldn't do anything without bribing somebody under the label of show a little respect. And I think that's one reason, I mean, the rottedness of particular societies, I think, got the subject on the agenda. I think the 18th century, I think was a very different kettle of fish, partly because people were the whole time deeply impressed by how much corruption there was in the British system. But also, of course, there was a strong collective interest on the part of substantial member of the landed classes and their distant relatives in keeping intact a system in which the public sector could be milked to provide vast numbers of sinecure jobs. And the notion that this was old corruption, I think, was very much the notion it had been going on a very long time. And of course, the generic description, I think, is the perverting of public resources to private gain. You go to Dubrovnik to this day, you go and look at the Doge's chair in the council chamber, and sitting above it, it says firmly, privatum ignoscere, i.e., leave your private affairs out of it. And I think that was the generic notion they all worked with, and extravagant figures like Rousseau, of course, just said they had a more elaborate and interesting story, and it went deeper than anybody thought. But I'm not certain that trying to get a definition before we start is going to get us very far. I think work from cases backwards.
Thank you.
The issue of perceptions versus reality. Well, when I started this business 10 years ago, I was very worried about the measurement things and all the critique that was against the measurement of corruption. I'm not so worried anymore for 3 reasons. First, yes, most of the measures are about perceptions, but when people decide about how to act, they have nothing else than their perceptions to go on. That is what so perceptions is what we're actually after. Nobody will ever find a real measure of the actual amount of bribes or corruption. Secondly, yes, there can be systems where the social services is reasonable effective, although corruption is quite high. China is one example, and I'm working desperately hard to try to figure out how China can have achieved such stunning development, having not extremely high corruption, but quite high corruption. I've solved this problem. I send you the paper if you email me. But to make a long story short, China has a type of public administration that is not Weberian. It's a type of public administration that you would call a missionary or clan or cadre organization where, yes, there is corruption, but the civil service is first highly professional and also committed not so much to the or at all to the communist doctrine, but to the mission of that specific organization. This is not a Chinese type of organization. There is one of the most famous books in public administration is Herbert Kaufman's The Forest Ranger, and that is exactly how the national how this organization worked in the United States. So this is a type of organization that public administration scholars don't really know so much about because they have difficulties handling it. But it's an enormously efficient type of administration, except it doesn't work very well with democracy, because democracy says now and then you should have a change in the policy of that type of public administration. But of course, China doesn't have this problem because there is no such thing. So it solves it by itself. The trust between public officials. I and my colleagues have criticized the dominant theory in corruption, which is an economic theory known as the principal agent theory, saying that corruption is a problem where you have honest principals and dishonest agents. And so the trick to get rid of corruption is for the honest principal to fix the incentives, so when fear of being caught is higher than the greed, things would go well. Now, this is not a very good theory for 2 reasons. One is, if corruption was an incentive problem, we would have solved it long ago. If there is one thing we know is how to fix incentives. But the worst thing with this theory is that it's a rational choice theory, which is of course okay, but it builds on an agent that is not supposed to be in the theory. That is the honest altruistic principle. Where should this person come from? This is a ghost, this is a phantom. And I think it's intellectually, I would say, unhealthy to have a theory that builds on an agent that's not supposed to be within the theory. We know from all systemically corrupt settings that the agents at the tops usually earn most rents from corruption, so they have no incentive to change the incentives for the dishonest agents. So instead we work with a theory basically Eleanor Ostrom type of collective action problem. We think that corruption is basically an idea is driven by reciprocity. So if you think that most of the people in your situation will do it, you're also likely to do it for a very simple reason. It makes very little sense to be the only one who doesn't pay bribes to the doctor to immunize your kids if everyone else is doing it. It's probably very dangerous to be the only honest policeman in a Mexican police force and so on. This has very important policy implications, because if we are right, if it's a collective problem, the changes cannot be instrumental. They must be of what I've called a Big Bang type of changes. So not only must you think that you should change, but you think that most other agents in your situation are now likely to change. And this calls for quite strong medicine, I would say. Now, my colleagues at the Quality of Government Institute, Lapointe and Dahlström, they are working with a very smart theory saying that the most important thing for not having corruption is that you have two types who run the political system. One are the democratically elected people, fine. The other one are the meritocratically recruited high-level civil servants, because they're not arguing for rule by experts, but I would say rule through experts. That means that these two groups, because they are recruited and have different types of, how should you say, base legitimacy, have difficulties to collude. So they cannot sort of form a corrupt alliance against the public, because they come from they have very different rationales. And I think this is a very smart theory. I'm really hoping they will succeed in this. The data comes in very, very handily, I can see.
Okay, we have a question here, and then Mike.
Okay, so my name is Zui. I'm from Colgate University, and this question is to Professor Rothstein. So you, in your speech, you have framed democracy and governance as two competing variables for development and well-being. But what's your view on the relationship between them? What's your view on, I guess, on the effect of the mode of governance to the quality of governance and on corruption control, especially? Thank you.
Thanks. And we have here in the third row.
Yeah, just a quick question, one to Roth.
Yes.
Yeah, I am Jude Ohanele from Development Dynamics Nigeria. Yeah. Relating quality of governance to well-being of people, and then, of course, quality of governance in itself meaning working on corruption. What sense do you make of the impact of working on preventing corruption, possibly using disruptive means and technologies to prevent, and then going to do some criminal justice damage control after the resources have been moved out of the public space into the private space? Is there any impact addressing these two issues, prevention and then post-corruption intervention? And then one to Debra. Considering the little example you gave on the impact of using market forces in security provision, do you have a sense that this might lead to further global insecurity, looking at what is happening here? Because if it does pay to securitize privately, then it's possible that we escalate insecurity across the globe so that more money are made. I don't know.
And here.
Hi, I'm Idris. I'm a Fulbright scholar at University of Syracuse. My question is to Bo, probably. I'm coming from Central Asia, where there's no democracy. We play democracy, it's not democracy, but we're always looking forward to see the best practice from other countries. And my specific interest is Singapore. What do you think, what are the best lessons to learn from Singapore? Not for just new democracies, but from established democracies. Thank you.
Small countries.
Yes.
Yes, I am Ana Maria Hernandez, the City University of New York, and I have a question for Debra as well. You used very interesting examples about the possibly deleterious effects of the privatization of prisons and armies, and my question has to do with the de facto privatization of formerly public university systems and the effect of the donors that have, I believe, a very important influence on the changes of curricular, very often against the wishes of the faculty, violations of governance, and in which donors determine curricula and the missions and the entire missions of universities. So I would like to ask you about that.
Thanks. And one more here.
Hi, my name is Majella from John Jay College, and my question is for Bo. In your presentation, you said that the democracy countries are most likely to have high level of corruption. What about the non-democratic country, for example, as Venezuela?
Okay. Are we ready? Okay.
Okay. So market security, of course so it would be one thing if states provided the optimal level of security, but they don't in many places. And so that's part of the argument about why, if we had an optimal level of security supplied by states, we wouldn't need to turn to private sector parties. Now, I think there's a governance question, because when you start bringing in private actors, there's serious governance questions both on a national scale and on a global scale. So there's got to be some system of regulation that probably involves, if you're going the institutional route, you might think of some regulatory scheme that encompasses both. If you have the intrinsic corruption idea, you might simply reject. You might think it's inappropriate for any non-state actors to be involved at all in the process of supplying military security in the world. There are a lot of dangers of relying only on states, though, as we know. So, and then let me just take the other question was about universities. Very interesting to think about. Privatization always brings, it doesn't always bring, but often brings costs and benefits. And so it's always a question to think through the various kinds of costs and benefits, but clearly you could make arguments both about institutional corruption when you think about, I think Alan started with thinking about admissions processes in private universities, the control of university mission by factors that are completely external to it. This raises, I think, Adrian's question about how distinct are institutional corruption and intrinsic corruption. So I tried to make part of the distinction that the usual way of thinking about intrinsic corruption is that the good is automatically extinguished, whereas institutional corruption often involves a series of actions that tend over time to undermine an institution. And you could debate what features are central to public university education, and then whether or not some practices we have tend to undermine the goals we have of having a public university system. So clearly these three, ideas, individual, institutional, and intrinsic, can be applied to a wide variety of goods.
Yeah, the questions about democracy and corruption, the statistics is pretty clear. The curve is Y-shaped, meaning that the worst corrupt countries are actually some of the newly democratized ones. For a simple reason, you can buy politicians there. I'm not saying that democracy sort of feeds corruption. What I'm saying is that you have democracies with very high corruption, you have democracies with very low corruption. And also you have democracies, take Italy, where the corruption varies enormously within one and the same country. It's also the case that you can say that, it's only young democracies that have this problem. This is also not true. Italy is not really a young democracy. Jamaica became a democracy in 1962. It's hopelessly corrupt. And take Greece, the cradle of democracy, which I have the former Greek Prime Minister Papandreou saying on record and in my face that the problems that has hit his country and has destabilized the euro now has nothing to do with the international financial markets. Everything, he says, everything is in our internal corruption. And if you read the OECD report on public administration in Greece, it's for an old, I'm basically a public administration scholar masquerading as a political scientist, but this is a nightmare read, I can say. On prevention and Singapore, this is questions you of course always get, what to do, how to prevent. And my argument has been, this is a quite young research operation. We have been basically going on for 10, 15 years, and it's too early to say. We really do not have any good recipes to sell to the world. And this is, of course, a little embarrassing, but if I'm correctly informed, our dear friends, the economists, really don't know how to prevent financial precious, right? Or our dear friends in criminologists really don't know how to fix crime, or our dear friends in gender studies have really not broken male patriarchy yet. So I'm not so, but let me say how the problem looks like. It looks like this. You have a lot of very statistically sophisticated analysis, very high level data. And these scholars they compare high corrupt with low corrupt countries, and they come up with causes that looks like this. Uncorrupt countries have a certain specific type of colonial history. They are usually Lutheran, they are ethnically homogeneous, they are small, and they are quite often islands. Now, best of luck, go to South Africa and say, please change your colonial history and become an island. And these are, it's very scientifically correct, but it's like going to the doctor if you have cancer, and the doctor will say, you should have had other parents. The other type is people who say this is an ethical problem. So say, in order not to have corruption, have high integrity in the civil service, ethical codes, independent courts. This is, of course, also correct, but it's basically saying in order not to have corruption, don't have it in the first place. There is no distance between the independent and dependent variable. They're basically saying, don't come close to the bacteria. That's the best thing. But so we are in between structuralism and trivialism. What I and my colleague try to find out is some type of institutional variables that are in between. Let me point quickly at 4. You have to have a good working tax system. If people don't pay taxes, they will not care about corruption because it's not their money. Secondly, universal education seems to be very good. Third, meritocratic recruitment helps. And then we find quite strong, even whatever we control for, there is something going on with gender equality. We are debating what it is, but it's very clearly so, both if you compare between countries and within countries, that there is something about gender equality. I don't think it's because women are genetically different from men. I think gender equality is a very strong signal from the political leaders about impartiality. Maybe if you shouldn't discriminate against women, you shouldn't discriminate against people who don't have the right contacts, who cannot pay, who don't belong to the right party. So all these 4 things are actually strong signals from the top about the importance of impartiality. About Singapore, I think nothing can be learned. It's such an extremely odd case. It's a small city-state with a dictator that, for some reason that nobody knows, were not into total rent-seeking. And it's basically idiosyncratic. I think what we tried to do in the project that I mentioned is that we tried to figure out what happened in the countries Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Sweden, when they mysteriously managed to get out of this suboptimal equilibrium in the 18th and 19th century. And I can say this is very hard archival work, I can say. Thank you.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 110% on your side about the virtuous circle of competence, legitimacy, more competence, more. I mean, that's clearly the virtuous circle if one can get it. And I'd have thought Singapore, there's an element of, large element of all that the payoff from behaving properly comes in. The only thing, a slightly sort of gloom-inducing kind I feel about this is that, although it's absolutely true, you can't go around saying, become a small island city-state, oh, go on, why don't you? If you take your sort of view about a sort of Elinor Ostrom approach to this, so not so much principal agent as solving a collective action problem, then it seems to me you get pulled in 2 directions, don't you? One of which is it's easier to solve that in small groups who seem to know each other quite well, which is why the temptation of the ethnic homogeneity story seems to kick in as a sort of substitute for face-to-face interaction and so on. But the other is, of course, that if you have a more decentralized, dispersed sort of political system, then it's harder for the center to control the behavior of people at the periphery. So there's always a danger of local corruption. And so you've got two things pulling in opposite directions. Is that right?
No.
No, good. Then explain what would be right.
Well, when we compare European states, we find no correlation at all between federalism and no. And take Canada, take Australia, quite low corrupt countries. If I'm correctly informed, they are quite federal. So it doesn't seem, if you have a corrupt center, it will sort of feed corruption down the system.
Right.
If you have an honest center, it may feed honesty down, but the statistics don't come in. I'm not saying you cannot learn things from Singapore. In the book that is on display there, I have a chapter comparing Singapore and Jamaica. Both were hopelessly poor in the early 1960s. Both were British colonies. And if anyone would have predicted the future of these two countries, one would have said, oh, Jamaica has a bright future. Lots of arable land, lots of natural resources, close to the world's biggest export market, especially as Cuba went out of business, you could have developed a fantastic tourist industry, wonderful. You would have said, Singapore, this is really problematic. Here, no natural resources, compared to Jamaica, lots of ethnic divisions, and far from any export markets. Now look at it now. Singapore is 10 times as rich as Jamaica and outperforms not only, of course, Jamaica, but most European countries in all the standard measures of human well-being. Fantastic. But there is only one little drawback here. During this whole period, Jamaica has been counted as a democracy, Singapore not. So this proves how important it is to get control of corruption and lower it for human well-being. But what I'm saying is, to replicate Singapore to a country like Nigeria, really not. I don't think so.
I think we have time for one more question, and there's one in the back.
Sure, yeah. Rob Casimir from the New York City Conflict of Interest Board. I have a question for Bo. I usually think of good municipal transparency controls and regulations, and then a free and active press as a good thing for government. But with the social trust model you've got there, isn't this sort of parade of maladies, could that be a bad thing if citizens are opening up the paper every day and reading about what is going on in government? Is this lowering the social trust? Is our government worse off for that in your model? I'm not sure I understand. Help me out.
We do not only do statistics. I may have given that impression. We also do interview and actually ethnographic studies of these things. So my colleagues went to the best and worst governed regions in Portugal, in Romania, in Italy, and did interviews with experts there. And the interesting thing is, both in the badly governed regions and the good governed regions, the experts they interview, basically journalists and high-level civil servants, and so they give the same answer. What is the problem and why it is so, more or less. And we just published a book about this where all the data and the case studies are. And the situation is this: yes, a vibrant and free and high quality media helps, but it can have actually the opposite effect. Jamaica has fantastic media. Hungary has great media, but they constantly sell this story that it doesn't matter who is in power because they are all equally corrupt. So it depends on how. Is corruption sort of the rule, or is corruption the opposite to the rule? Because if the media constantly sells that corruption is the rule, it's a problem. Then in some areas, of course, you can buy journalists. So it's good, but it's not the universal recipe against bad government. No.
On that last point about buying journalists, there's a very old and deplorable English rhyme, appropriate in the days of Murdoch's friend Rebecca Brooks having a rough time in court. It simply goes, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there seems no reason to."
I think on that note, we can well conclude.